In order to make a canopy that looks like it has good depth to it, I like to start with my most distant colors and work my way forward. So my most distant color in this case would be just this pure white that I'm using to make the effect of just a sky light shining through. If you were to take a photograph inside of a shaded area and try to get all of these colors to show up, the exposure in order to get these colors would cause the sky to just be a bright white light, typically. I actually don't know if that's true. I just said that. I wanted that overexposed look of bright light coming through the back side. So then you can see a very yellow shade of green. And the reason that it's such a yellow color is because when sunlight strikes through a plant, it creates the yellowest shade of green that will be in the whole system of colors when you're doing plants. You can see this plant right here is a good example of this, just a house plant that the homeowners have sitting here. And you can see where the stems go deepest by the roots. You can see the layers underneath are a more shadowed shade of green that is less yellow, where the brighter shades of green have more yellow. So when I'm doing that first layer of these brightest colors, I have a shade of green that's very light and closer to yellow, like I said, and then I have another shade of green that I use side by side that's less yellow, a little closer to blue, but also very light. I use mostly the yellower shade, as you can see on this back layer. And while that layer of greens is still wet, or even as it's mostly dry, I actually paint the negative space, that white, or in other areas of this mural, a light blue. I paint the negative space into it and then just do this thing where I go across it real quick with a somewhat dry brush, and it just kind of blends it all together. The reason I do that is because it's easier to paint negative space sometimes than to do each little leaf. A green has to be either more blue or more yellow. It's made from only two colors, yellow and blue. So it has to be more of one or the other. So when sunlight strikes through it, it's more yellow. When it's more shaded and has indirect light on it, it's closer to blue. But I don't want you to confuse that with being a bluish green, because if it gets too blue, it starts to look real unnatural. To be less yellow is to be closer to blue, but it's still just more of a true green in the more shadowed areas like these. So that was a really long way of explaining that it gets less yellow as it comes toward me. You need obscurity in the background in order to make the foreground more three-dimensional, and those sharp edges, those vivid sharp edges against all of these soft and blurred obscure edges causes a real stark separation between the foreground and background. So this is a real important element of depth, is that difference in focus, or in photography terms, depth of field, you might call it, where the camera is focused at a certain depth and unfocused on the depth beyond or before that. So I made this background a lot looser, and you can see that all of this is pretty loose brush strokes, while up in here I have these real defined sharp edges. The next color that I'll use after I do that first layer is, you could do 100 different stages. The next stage is just one that is both darker in shade and less yellow in hue. So it's going to be greener and darker each time I build a layer. So this is different than if you're on the outside of a tree looking in, because if you're on the outside looking in, you have a lot of direct sunlight bouncing off the surface of all of the leaves, and you get a lot of intense light directly shining on the surface, rather than when you're inside of a tree looking out, you see a lot of the sunlight coming through the leaves. And the ones that are closest to you are not even indirect sunlight. So that's why you see these bluer and grayer colors. These shadows, these represent the leaves that are underneath the canopy and lit by the indirect sunlight bouncing off of all of the canopy, and the skylight, just the blue sky coming through the forest and lighting everything up. It looks very different and a lot more muted than the most intense colors from direct sunlight. Each layer, I added little bits of white for reflection. White represents the reflected light bouncing off the surface of leaves. So you can, while each layer is wet, I like to put little bits of white, just add white right to the paint that's already on there, and that makes it look like light just reflecting off the surface of leaves. And I can mix that same white into every single layer while maintaining the differences in the colors besides white that I have in those layers. And when I got to my darkest layer, that's where I made the most use of the white. So before I did all of these real vivid foreground leaves, I did this, where these were my foreground leaves that you see here. And that's where I used the most white, because you get darker, 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 that brings things forward, but then to give it good dimension, good depth, and like three-dimensional objects, you add all of this white now to build the highlights out so that you have it looking like clusters of leaves, because you're no longer representing the light coming through the leaves but bouncing off. White is the color for bouncing off of the surface of the leaves. And so it gives it that look. I don't know what I'm trying to say. Okay. So then, here, I started over. I just started the whole system over. I started with a different yellowish green that was darker. So in this one, I had a lot of white added. But when I started my whole system over again, I had a yellowish green that was already darker. This is a system of colors, a relationship between colors, not specific hues, not any specific color that causes this to look the way it does, but the relationship between them all. Because I have the same system used to do this. First, the background and foreground, the first time I used a different set of colors, but the same system to do this darker, more vivid foreground. In both of these systems, I had pre-mixed my bluer, darker green that you see in this background and foreground system here. This one here is my darker bluer green. This one is my lighter yellower green. I had those pre-mixed. And then this is the two of them mixed together right here. This is the mix of this lighter one and this darker one. And each time I made a layer forward, I mixed my darker into it. So it keeps the system real consistent and keeps it from getting too complicated with millions of different hues, you know what I mean? Then this one, same thing. You could see my darkest color I had pre-mixed, and I just used yellow and blue and black to make that color. And then this one just has yellow and blue and a little bit of white, but not nearly as much white as this one. Each layer I add, I mix more of this dark green into my lighter yellow green until I get to my final forward layers. Then I start adding the white. And while it's still wet on the wall, but you can let it dry too and just mix the two together. However you do it, what's important is that I mixed this dark color then with white. Adding white to a color, as I said, creates the look of reflected light glare off the surface. Just like you see on these, you can see on some of these lower leaves, you can see there's some glare. And that glare you do in paintings just by adding white. Or if it was some brightly colored light, then it would be the color of that. But since it's coming from the sky, it's for the most part white. And then I just get more and more white until I get my lightest shade that I want. And in some areas, I even just leave pure white. It's still a pretty loose technique. You know, I can see some sloppy little brush strokes, but who cares? I mean, it's a huge mural. I don't think the shape of the leaves matters so much. You can see that I'm just using circles because aspen leaves are pretty much just a bunch of little circles. And a mural this size, I'm not going to spend too much time on individual leaves. But I do think that the growing size as they come forward does matter because this creates perspective. The smaller shapes in the background, the larger shapes in the foreground with all the sharp edges. So there's that distinct size difference so that I have perspective. But the actual shapes of the leaves, you know, I didn't even put stems on them. I mean, they're just floating circles. It's actually amazing to me how just the different colors, the different degrees of white added causes these to be like coins flipping in the light. You know, it causes them to look like they're at an angle. Color creates shape in angles. So what you need to accomplish this kind of look is to have your bright yellowish green pre-mixed and then your darkest, most foreground, more bluish green, but not too blue, pre-mixed. And you need to be sure that it's both dark and less yellow. It doesn't really matter so much how extreme those differences are. It will create this look just by having that difference. And by pre-mixing them and using them as the far ends of the extremes to create every color in the middle, you keep the system real consistent so that it creates a real continuous depth as it comes forward. If you want to get real detailed, you can do some leaves like I have. I don't know if you can see this one here, but it's where I have half of the leaf has the light white on it, half of the leaf has the darker green. And you can, yeah, they don't all, every leaf doesn't have to be one color. You can do all kinds of combinations. The goal is to work from the yellower to the darker. To combine yellow light and blue light is not the same as to filter yellow light through a blue substance. Like if I shine a yellow light on a blue surface, it might just appear white. Or if I shine blue light on a yellow surface, I just get the result of white. Or if I shine blue light and a yellow light on a gray surface, again, white light. But if I shine yellow light through a blue lens, be green.